So, from one totalitarian regime to another. The last video was from Russia and Ukraine. I came across another report, this time about China and Hong Kong. Um, it's from The Guardian. I'm just going to read it out. It's not too long, so bear with me. Then I'll share some of my thoughts. So I'll just read this out. The report is from the 15th of June, so 2 days ago, and it's by Helen Davidson in Taipei. I'll just make the text a little bit bigger. It's a little bit small at the moment. Hong Kong textbooks will claim city was never a British colony. New Hong Kong textbooks will teach students that the city was never a British colony after an overhaul of the school subject that authorities have blamed for driving the pro-democracy protests. According to local reports, a new text will teach students that the Chinese government didn't recognise the treaties that ceded the city to Britain after the Opium Wars. This was the settlement of 1841. They ended in 1997 when Britain returned Hong Kong to Chinese control, and therefore the texts claim Hong Kong was never a British colony. The new books also adopt Beijing's narrative that the 2019 protest movement was driven by external forces, South China Morning Post reported. Four sets of textbooks for Hong Kong's liberal studies subject were released online last week for schools who choose materials for the new academic year in September. They are said to be used by fourth form students in citizenship and social development classes, which replaced the liberal studies course designed in 2009 to teach students critical thinking. In 2020, the liberal studies course was attacked by pro-Beijing authorities who blamed it for driving youth toward protest and pledged rectification, in other words, thinking for themselves. The chief executive, Carrie Lam, said students needed protection from being poisoned and fed false and biased information. And she claimed she wasn't a Beijing stooge. Subsequent overhaul of the education system included an increased focus on national security and patriotism. Teachers encouraged to report students who breached the national security law. It is necessary for schools to teach students to think positively and to love their nation, the head of Hong Kong's education department said on Monday. Several of the textbooks discuss the 2020 national security law, widely criticized as infringing on basic freedoms by outlawing acts of dissent as terrorism, secession, foreign collusion, or sedition. One reportedly says the law was introduced in response to violent terrorist activities and illegal acts in 2019 which endangered national sovereignty and security. Another mentioned national security 400 times across 121 pages, the report said. China's state-backed tabloid, the Global Times, said the changes would ensure some teachers will no longer be able to convey their wrong and poisonous political views to students when teaching this course. Tang Fei, an editor and reviewer of two of the textbooks and also a Hong Kong legislator, told the outlet the texts had passed internal review and were now awaiting final approval. With the new text, there will be no need for school teachers to bring in too much other content, Tang said. The proposed new textbooks come just weeks before Hong Kong marks 25 years since the British handover. The territory was promised 50 years of semi-autonomy, but activists argue the post-2019 crackdown, national security law, electoral changes, and growing central government interventions in civil society and the media in effect ended that autonomy already. This year's anniversary on the 1st of July will also mark the first day in office for the city's new Beijing appointed leader John Lee. Lee, the former security chief, will take over from Lam. China's senior leaders have traditionally attended the swearing-in ceremony. Xi Jinping's attendance has not been confirmed, but speculation increased after at least one Hong Kong primary school announced it was looking for pupils to spend a week in hotel quarantine, suggesting preparations for a strict closed-loop system which will allow Xi to visit. Funny how dictators like to be kept in bubbles. Putin's the same. That pretty much lays it out. It's been reported in other sources, but the Guardian puts credit; it doesn't have a paywall. Um, it's grotesque, but it's not surprising. I mean, it really isn't surprising, and we shouldn't be surprised that a single-party state that has been built on lies and existed on lies for so long wants to lie about yet another issue. Um, I mean, they lie about Mao's crimes, the Great Famine, Great Leap Forward, the millions who were persecuted under Mao and died under Mao. They lie about Tiananmen, obviously. We've just passed the 33rd anniversary of Tiananmen. They lie about what they're doing to the Uyghurs right now. They lie about COVID. They lie and they lie and they lie. You know, China always gets very competitive in the Olympics. Well, they deserve a gold medal when it comes to lies. And for me, when it comes to Hong Kong, I've mixed concerns. I say mixed concerns because I think there is still very strong sentiments of opposition, and I don't think that the communist regime will find that it is that easy to just brainwash 7.5 million people who, many cases, hate the CCP. And I'm not naive. I know that there are loyalists there as well to Beijing. There will be people who think, well, we want stability, so let's go with communism. And this is why how protest is done is so important because I think the vast majority of the protests were responsible, but in the end, some of them did get out of hand, and there was, we have to be honest, there was vandalism and there was some stupid things done. Chinese bookstores and so on vandalized. That was stupid. Um, my message to those young Hong Kongers who are concerned about this and they're looking at the situation is don't give up and never ever stop telling the truth. Um, I don't want to say that this is something that's going to change because they're going up against the power of one of the world's most ruthless and powerful regimes. But so long as that knowledge exists, I mean, okay, they might make it legal to talk about in classrooms, and the real danger, of course, is young children being brainwashed. I think the generation of teenagers and young people in the 20s and 30s, they know the truth. And nothing the CCP ever does will get that truth out of their minds. They can't, it's impossible. Hong Kong was a British colony. Um, it was administered by the Crown. We could get into the moral issues around that, about it was colonialism, whether it was right or wrong. But the fact is, it was a British colony up until 1997 for a period of over 130 years. So there's just nothing that the CCP can do to change that history. What I'm saying is, in the mainland, which has never been democratic, truly democratic, it is relatively easy to, control the whole press and control information. I think in Hong Kong it's harder. This isn't to say that the CCP isn't prevailing. I mean, people are leaving Hong Kong. Um, they're prevailing, and a city of 7.5 million people could never take on a rising superpower of 1.4 billion. Of course not. But I think so long as young people in Hong Kong have that knowledge, I mean, they can't. I think there'll be a lot of probably heated debates between Hong Kongers of my generation and younger, and then the very young Hong Kongers who will be growing up. Unfortunately, they will be brainwashed by this new curriculum. There's going to be a real onus on those young protesters to switch their attentions, perhaps to not trying to stop the CCP because it's impossible, but to to inform the younger brothers and younger sisters of the truth. And it's easy for me to say that in the comfort of the UK. I know there's real risks involved, but the biggest tragedy and the biggest danger would be if the CCP manages to turn Hong Kong into just another, well, resembling another mainland city. So that 20 years from now, most Hong Kongers will be brainwashed and they will think, yeah, the British were here, but and I don't even know how they're practically going to do it because what are they going to do with all the archives and the photographs showing the Crown on Hong Kong police, showing British flags everywhere. I mean, how are they going to explain that? If their line is going to be the British were colonialist invaders, well, how will they explain that if the British were colonialist invaders on Chinese land, then they will have to explain why didn't they get rid of them in 130 years? You know, people will ask that question. They will say, well, if the British were colonial invaders, why were they there for so long? And I think older Hong Kongers will remember the British era. I've never said it was perfect. I've never said it was truly democratic, but I do think I just don't think that anyone who went through that period will say it was worse than what the communists are proposing to basically make people think they can't, to have a controlled media, to just make Hong Kong another mainland city. Um, but what is so sickening and so perverse is the extent of control that the CCP has on information in the mainland. Um, young Chinese, I'm talking now about mainlanders, when they come to the West, they hear the BBC, they hear CNN, and they will claim that they think freely and they think objectively. And I think they probably want to. But even in that generation, you can see the influence of communist state because from a very early age, the point I would want to make, having been to the country twice, it's not really about communism in the sense of um, socialist thought or Marxist Leninist ideology. It's not really about that. It's more about nationalism. That's the true ingredient of the CCP today. It isn't really socialism or, the workers to share the means and all of that. That's part of it. But the real thing is nationalism. And it's toxic because what they do is they brainwash children from a very young age to love the motherland. Now, you could argue American kids also get that. They have flags in their classrooms and so on, but not to the same extent. Not to this sort of dogmatic, intense, extreme nationalism that goes on in China. I've personally witnessed it. I mean, when I used to go to classrooms in the morning, I think it was every Monday, they would get every single student in the school. We're talking about 5,000 students because Chinese schools are big. And you'd have the tannoy would do the national anthem. Then you'd have patriotic speeches for about an hour. And this would be drilled into the students every single week. Now, teenagers anywhere are going to have distractions. They're going to have computer games. They're going to be thinking about girls or boys, and that's good in the case of China because if they find the dogma boring, then they won't be taking it in, and I hope that's the case. But I have seen firsthand how how the Chinese state works, how it gets people to think in a certain way. So it doesn't matter if, say, a young Chinese person who's 21, 22 travels to a Western country, they may think that they're being more open-minded, and hopefully they will go down that path. But if they still find themselves forcefully defending the Chinese government or interpreting criticism of the CCP as being anti-China, then they are being influenced by that ideology. What I would say to them is just because someone's criticizing the Chinese government doesn't mean they're anti-China. Um, that's the point. But I think this is another area we need to be really, really assertive about what's going on in British campuses or other Western campuses, Australian, Canadian, and so on. I think we should close down all Confucius institutes because they are promoting these lies. I think they should just be closed down. And if the Chinese embassy whines about it, let them. Just let them. I mean, if we are powerless to do anything within China, which we largely are, they should be powerless to do anything in Britain. Um, so I think we should close all Confucius Institutes. I think every university in the country should seriously assess its China West program, its whatever it's variously called. Um, And if there are connections, if, for example, academics are getting money from the Chinese state for some sort of mutual science program or something like that on the surface, it needs to be very closely vetted because more often than not, you will have a situation that looks harmless enough. It's just shared science research or something. But when you trace it back to China, it's connected to the military or directly to the Chinese government. So I think British academics need to be very careful um, because if they're knowingly sharing information concerning, for example, technology that can be used in a military sense, they might find that they're borderline treasonous, frankly, because that information could be used by the Chinese military. So I think the government needs to put pressure on universities, threaten to withdraw funding, seriously withdraw funding, among other areas they can look at. I wouldn't stop Chinese students coming here, but I would say they should be reminded that they're guests in this country and should behave in an appropriate way, by which that means enjoy their time, take in the experience. They've paid a lot of money, so they should get all the opportunities that are come with that. But if they, for example, bully Hong Kong peers because of their views on the CCP, then they should be expelled. No questions asked. That should be it should be investigated, and if they found to be bullying their peers, they should be expelled. Now, some will say, well, Nathan, it should work both ways, but from what I've observed, it's mainlanders who do most of the bullying. It may sometimes work the other way, and if, for example, you have a mainland student who's been given a hard time solely because of their nationality, that's wrong. That shouldn't be the case either. But it's not an equilibrium. It's not, and I think it is going on because mainland students act as little agents of the CCP. They can say that they don't, and they get very defensive and say, "Oh, we're not communists. We're not." Okay, well, prove it. Stop getting so defensive and so nationalistic, and actually consider that you're now in the West. You're now in a multi-party state. People have different opinions. You're entitled to your opinion. But if you're going to defend the Chinese government, don't complain about being associated with it. Um, and basically, they have to respect the host nation. I think individually, most of them do, but human nature being what it is, when you have that group dynamic, I mean, when I worked at my local university, most of the students we worked with, I worked in the foreign affairs, the department. Our job basically was showing international students around. The Chinese tended to stick among themselves. We had some Arab students as well, and they would do the same thing, to be fair. But the Chinese tended to be in big groups, maybe with shared language, among other factors, and that's fine. But um, I find that that group dynamic can also mean that individuals don't think for themselves. So, yeah, if you're Chinese and watching this, I would just say if you're defending what the CCP does in China, then I'm going to defend the idea that we should be able to say we're not going to have propaganda in this country. And I think Confucius Institutes should be immediately closed down. Sweden done it. Why can't we do it? One of my biggest frustrations with this country is we do too little too late, or we just bide our time. We bide our time with so many things. Um, there's no reason why we should wait a day longer for these institutes to be closed down because on the surface they might sound like cultural programs, but they're absolutely being used by the CCP to push this propaganda. And I think it would be an absolute grotesque lie if you have Confucius Institutes in the UK um, telling students, Chinese and otherwise, that Hong Kong was never a British territory. We should not be allowing these sort of bodies to be used as fifth columns. And I don't think it's paranoid. I think there's verifiable evidence that China has a malevolent influence in this country. It's happening in other countries as well. The CCP, they're a bunch of thugs. They can push their weight around. I would just close with this. Sometimes when it comes to China, it can be daunting. It can be like it could seem unstoppable. It's big, it's powerful, 1.4 billion people. But I think there maybe is some cracks beneath the surface. Um, it may well be that it's not as all powerful as it seems. Even China has weaknesses. Xi Jinping has weaknesses. I think, for example, that lockdown in Shanghai, um, that will make a lot of people very, very angry. It did, in fact, and they won't forget that. So sooner or later, I think the CCP is going to trip up and make a serious mistake that will turn its own people against it, um, with some luck. I sincerely hope in my lifetime the CCP falls. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but I do hope it happens in my lifetime, and I hope one day, and I know it's a long shot, I know it's highly unlikely at this point, but strange things have happened in history. I mean, who could have thought that at the height of the Soviet Union, that by the 1990s it would all be gone? So strange things have happened in history. Who could have thought, indeed, at the height of the British Empire, that we would no longer rule the waves? Every power eventually has its day. The CCP is not going to last forever. It might last another 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. At some point, I believe, in this century, they will fall. It'll probably be later rather than sooner, but it will happen. And I hope whoever replaces them, I hope, I hope more than anything for China, that the Chinese people are finally given the truth and it becomes a situation whereby one party doesn't control everything. That would be my greatest hope for China. I don't think it's ever going to resemble a liberal democracy, but if at least it can be a situation where one ruling regime doesn't control absolutely everything, that would be a great improvement. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. But shame on their lives.